Welcome to English Plus Podcast, the English we speak, and much more. Learn English, expand your knowledge, and enjoy through our vocabulary builder, novel, grammar, literature, psychology, essential guides, and poetry episodes. Support English Plus Podcast by becoming a patron of the show on Patreon. Use the link in the description to support our podcast and to help our free e-learning journey continue. Welcome to the second episode of the literature series from English Plus Podcast, in which we're featuring the works of the ancient Greek poet Homer, this time with an exploration of what may be the first and greatest adventure of all time, the Odyssey. In the sequel to the Iliad, written probably when Homer was a mature man and sometime around 750 BC, the poet follows the travels of Odysseus, a hero of the Trojan War, doomed to travel 10 years after the end of the war before he can return to his home in Ithaca. The idea of an extended journey is a popular one in fiction and has never been exhausted, for it offers a chance to symbolize inner journeys. In this case, the dramatic journey of Odysseus from Troy to Ithaca is a metaphysical journey from death to life, for he returns to his home as a man who has been tested, who has come through his personal rite of passage, and is now far more a man than when he left. This idea of a hero's journey has been a perpetual theme in Western literature ever since Homer established it. The formula in such journeys is separation, initiation, and return. The hero sets out from the world of familiarity and common experience into a region of supernatural wonder. He encounters terrific forces and must undergo terrible ordeals. But he is victorious. He then returns from his adventures with new powers and insight and becomes admired and respected by his fellow man. This is the traditional pattern, and it owes its roots to the epic story you'll learn about in this episode. You became familiar with the background of this story in our last episode on the Iliad. But let's review a few important points. Odysseus set out for the Trojan War unwillingly. He's been told by an oracle that if he went, he wouldn't return home for 20 years. At first, he tried to feign sanity, but his trick was exposed and he had to join the other Greeks in their battle to win the city of Troy. He was a strong warrior, but was known more for his cunning and intelligence than for his strength. The battle for Troy lasted 10 years, and at the end of that time, although the Greeks were victorious, Odysseus knew there were still 10 years remaining before the prophecy of his 20-year absence was fulfilled. He was one of the few great warriors to survive the Trojan War, yet he was deprived the opportunity to return home a hero. There are many differences between the story of the Odyssey and that of the Iliad. The Iliad honors the hero, the man of honor who stands out in battle, because he performs better and he has more arete, or excellence, than any other warrior. Heroism in the Odyssey is another matter. Odysseus is not the young, confident warrior he and Achilles once were. He's older, tired after 20 years of warfare and travel, and he's in exile. Instead of strength or arete, it is craftiness and resourcefulness that gets him by. The Iliad is the great epic of battles, destruction, and death. The Odyssey is the great epic of travel and adventure. The Iliad reflected the values and struggles of ancient Greek men, but the Odyssey reflects the struggles of every man and every time. This explains the enduring significance of the book. By the 5th century BC, 300 years after Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey had become the Old and New Testaments of the Greeks. They were the strongest literary, religious, and social forces in Greek life. In the following centuries, Homer would continue to be the inspiration for stories, plots, themes, and mythology for other writers and philosophers, and would disappear only for a time in areas where the Greek language was unknown. Socrates quoted Homer in the famous trial for his life. Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad on his journeys. Virgil duplicated the pattern of the Odyssey in his Aeneid almost to the point of plagiarism. and or even Homeric passages in the New Testament. His influence continued through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and beyond, inspiring Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, Keats, Tennyson, and others too numerous to mention. In modern times, the effect of his work is just as strong. The two most famous Homer-inspired books being James Joyce's Ulysses and Nikos Kazantzakis' Odyssey. Films too have been profoundly influenced by Homer's epics, the most obvious example being Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, based on Arthur Clarke's novel that translated Homer's poem of land and sea into a space journey. The centuries of acclaim that have followed Homer are only part of his success, for he also gave the Greeks of his time a national identity. Before Homer, Greeks tended to identify their own region and kingdom, but it was his books that inspired in them a sense of unity and pride in being Greek. For that, he has always been especially admired and appreciated in his own homeland. The Odyssey is organized into three main parts, and readers often find the chronology or order of events confusing. The first part of the book tells the adventures of Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. Telemachus has been at home in Ithaca, awaiting his father's return, along with his mother and Odysseus' faithful wife Penelope. But shortly after the beginning of the book, Telemachus sets out on a voyage to see if he can learn news of his father. In the second part of the book, Homer relates the sea adventures and travels of Odysseus himself as he relates them to his hosts, the Phaeacians. In the last part of the book, Odysseus returns to Ithaca and must re-establish himself in his household, which has been overrun by suitors seeking the hand of the loyal Penelope. Odysseus is not present in the entire first third of the book, although he is an indirect presence, since the thoughts and actions of the other characters center around him. The entire Odyssey takes place in less than 6 weeks, but in this 40-day framework, Homer includes the history of the past 19 years through flashback and recollection. We learn about the Trojan War, the fate of its heroes, and the adventure of Odysseus in the period that followed the war. The actual story begins at the end of Odysseus' wanderings, 40 days before he returns home. At this point, he's on the deserted island of Calypso, alone and weeping. He's already experienced enchanted isles, one-eyed giants, sorceresses, and cannibals. Homer chooses this moment because it's a pivotal point in the adventure. Odysseus has been tested, has triumphed, and can return home reborn. Before we begin in the details of this Odyssey, here's a brief summary of the major characters in the story. The hero Odysseus is a native of Ithaca, a veteran of the Trojan War, a man short and strong in build, known for his cleverness and wiles. It was he who thought up the idea of the famous Trojan horse gambit, which gave the Greeks final victory over Troy. He's a favorite of Athena, goddess of war, wisdom, and craft. She is the shrewdest of gods. He is the shrewdest of mortals. Odysseus can be unscrupulous and merciless, but he's also resourceful, skilled, and has a curious, inquiring mind. Penelope is Odysseus' wife and has become a symbol throughout the ages of fidelity. She waits devotedly in Ithaca for 19 years for the return of her husband, rejecting her many suitors and resisting the pressure of her community, which would like her to marry again. Even her own doubts as to whether Odysseus is still alive can't dissuade her from her loyalty.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Looking to enhance your English skills while exploring a world of knowledge? Then English Plus Podcast website is just for you. Dive into diverse topics ranging from science to literature, history to business, and myths to modern insights. Each episode from our podcast or article from our magazine is a journey of learning and discovery, designed to not only improve your language skills, but also broaden your understanding of the world. Join us at English Plus Podcast, where language meets limitless learning. Tune in today and take your English to the next level. Visit EnglishPlusPodcast.com to start your journey. English Plus Podcast, language, learning, enlightenment. Never stop learning with English Plus. Telemachus is the son of Penelope and Odysseus. At the beginning of the story, he's an adolescent, but he proves his manhood later when he fights by his father's side. Eumaeus and Euryclea are two servants in Odysseus' household who both remained faithful to the family and to its absent master. Eumaeus is a swineherd and will later help Odysseus slay Penelope's suitors. Euryclea is Telemachus' nurse. Eurymachus is the leader of the suitors for Penelope's hand. He's a suave, hypocritical liar. Laertes is Odysseus' father. In grief over his lost son, he is withdrawn from the city and lives on a farm. Poseidon is the god of the sea and a sworn enemy of Odysseus. This is because Odysseus has blinded his son the Cyclops. Circe is a goddess who tries unsuccessfully to turn Odysseus and his crew into swine. Her charms keep Odysseus from leaving her for a year. The Cyclopses are a race of one-eyed giants. Calypso is a minor goddess who keeps Odysseus on her island of Ogygia. Her name means concealer. The Lotus Eaters are people who drug themselves by eating lotus and spend their time in complete withdrawal from reality and a permanent state of euphoria. These are the characters, mortal and immortal, natural and supernatural, who played key roles in the Odyssey. Now let's begin the story. After the Greeks had defeated the Trojans at Troy and peace had been re-established, the Greek heroes who survived returned home. All except Odysseus, who after many adventures had been taken captive by the goddess Calypso, who loved him and kept him on her island. Odysseus longed for his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Unknown to him, Penelope was surrounded by suitors who had moved into her palace and who argued for her hand in marriage. She's also receiving pressure from the community of Ithaca, which wants her to marry so they can have a king again. Now it's the time ordained by the gods for Odysseus' return. They meet on Olympus except for Poseidon, enemy of Odysseus, who is absent. Athena, Odysseus' friend and guardian, asked Zeus to send a message to Calypso saying she must release her captive. Then Athena herself goes to Ithaca, Odysseus' homeland, to see his son Telemachus. Athena adopts the disguise of a man and tells Telemachus she knows his father. She says he's still alive and advises Telemachus to send the suitors home and urge his mother to return to her father's house. There, if she wants to marry again, she can make the announcement and plan her wedding. Then Telemachus should set sail to find his father's former friends in battle. Perhaps they can give him clues as to his father's whereabouts. She suggests Nestor, the elderly advisor to the Greek troops at Troy, and Menelaus, the husband of Helen, who was the whole cause of the Trojan War. Telemachus has recognized the goddess, and now he's filled with hope and strength. He scolds his mother for her laxness with the suitors, and then summons a council to determine if the suitors should be sent home. The suitors complain about this plan. They say Penelope had promised to choose from among them once she completed a blanket she was weaving for Odysseus' father Laertes. All day she would weave, but at night she would undo her work, so the task was never completed. Now the suitors will be put off no longer. Eurymachus, as their leader, insisted Penelope make a decision. But two eagles fly overhead, and the men take it as an omen. They cease their arguments. A soothsayer says the eagles mean that Odysseus is about to return. Telemachus, in spite of the mockery and jeers he received from others, orders that a ship and crew be ready so he can search for news of his father. Athena disguises herself again and orders a galley and oarsmen. Telemachus' nurse Euryclea helps him get the necessary provisions. With the disguised goddess beside him, He sails from Ithaca. First, Telemachus travels to Pylos, where Nestor lives. The old man tells him of the horrible fate of Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces of Troy. When Agamemnon returned home, his unfaithful wife murdered him with help of her lover, his own cousin. But Nestor has heard nothing of Odysseus since he sailed from Troy. Telemachus leaves and travels by chariot to Sparta, where Menelaus lives. Menelaus is entertaining at his home with his wife, the famous Helen, beside him. He tells the young man sadly that his father is imprisoned on the Isle of Ogygia. He heard this tale from a sea god. Telemachus prepares to return to his ship. When the people in Ithaca realize Telemachus is missing, one of the suitors sets out to waylay him at the straits. Penelope weeps in fear for her son, but Athena comes to her in a dream and assures her of Telemachus' safety. Athena then complains to Zeus that no messenger has yet been sent to Calypso to demand Odysseus' release. Zeus finally sends Hermes down. The island of Ogygia is very beautiful, but Odysseus is immune to its beauty. He sits on the beach, dreaming of home. Calypso approaches him with the news that she's received from Hermes. The news is all joy to Odysseus and all sorrow to the goddess who loves him. Odysseus builds a ship and heads out with Calypso's directions to guide him. But Poseidon, the sea god who dislikes Odysseus, raises a storm that destroys the ship. Odysseus saves his life by clinging to a spar. A sea nymph takes pity on him and gives him a scarf that will keep him safe as long as he wears it. But when he reaches shore, he must cast it back to the sea. On the third day after the shipwreck, Odysseus lands on a strange island and falls asleep, exhausted on a bed of leaves. The island belongs to the Phaeacians, a seafaring people. The princess of the island, who is named Nausicaa, has a strange dream about a marriage in which large amounts of linen are required. So the next morning, she sends her maidens to the shore so they can wash all the household linens. The maidens complete their task and then play ball. Their noise awakens Odysseus, who covers himself with an olive bow and approaches them. Nausicaa is attracted to him and thinks he would make just the right kind of husband. So she takes him to the palace of her father, the king. The king feeds and entertains Odysseus and orders games in his honor. The people try to coax Odysseus into playing, and when this fails, they goad him with insults. Finally, he gets up and plays. His great skill shames the others. Then Odysseus asks the minstrel to sing of the siege of Troy and of the great wooden horse. The minstrel agrees. He sings of the final strategy of the Greeks, how they built a vast horse of wood, pretending it was an offering to the gods, then decamped and sailed away. The Trojans dragged the great animal inside the walls of Troy. A company of Greeks hidden in the belly of the creature poured forth during the night and opened up the gates for their returned comrades. With them they burned and pillaged the proud city. The bard sang that it was Odysseus who conceived the plan and who led the band inside the horse. It was also he who stormed the house where Helen was held and restored her to her Greek husband Menelaus. Odysseus begins to cry as the poet sings, so the king stops the tale. He asks why Odysseus is weeping, and his guest replies, "I am Odysseus." At that point, the entire story of Odysseus' wandering comes out. He says he and his companions left Troy and landed on the shores of Thrace, where they had plundered the local towns. They feasted there until morning, when they were surprised by a band of natives who killed many of them. The survivors returned with Odysseus to the sea, but they were soon caught in a storm that carried them off course for 10 days. When they found land, they discovered they were in the strange land of the lotus eaters. Many of Odysseus' companions ate of the lotus and were drugged into such forgetfulness and serenity that they had to be carried by force back to the ship. There, they had to be bound securely, for they refused to leave this island. The next stop was the island of the Cyclops, fierce giants with but one single eye in the center of their foreheads. Not knowing of this danger, Odysseus and his men set out to explore the island. They found a huge cave with vast stores of milk and cream and sat down to await the return of the owner. The owner was a Cyclops, a son of Poseidon, and when he entered, he imprisoned the men and then began to devour them 2 at a time at each meal. Luckily, Odysseus had with him a skin of strong wine. He gave it to the giant, who drained it and asked Odysseus his name. Odysseus said it was No Man, and the Cyclops responded that since No Man had been so kind, No Man would be the last to be eaten. The wine had its effect, and the Cyclops fell into a deep sleep. Odysseus hardened a pointed stick of olive wood by charring it in the giant's fire. Then he and the crew thrust it deep into the single eye of the Cyclops. Blinded and screaming with pain, the Cyclops called for help, and the neighboring Cyclops came running, asking him who had injured him. When the Cyclops replied, No man, they returned to their homes in disgust. Then the Cyclops rolled the huge stone from his cave door so his sheep would run out. He was sure the men would be hiding among them, and that if he felt among the sheep he would find them. But Odysseus outwitted him. He tied the sheep 3 abreast and tied a man in under each middle sheep. Then he clung to the wall of a huge ram and made his own escape. When the Greeks reached the safety of their ship, Odysseus yelled back at the Cyclops to taunt him. The monster hurled a rock that barely missed the ship. Then Odysseus boastingly told the Cyclops his real name. The furious beast invoked the vengeance of his father Poseidon on this mortal who had destroyed his sight forever. The Greeks sailed on through unfamiliar seas and at one point became the guest of the king of the winds, whose name was Aeolus. When they left, Aeolus gave Odysseus an ox hide bound with a silver cord. Inside were all the winds of the world except Zephyr, who would carry them right to home. For 9 days and nights they sailed towards Ithaca, and during that time it was always Odysseus at the helm. At last they saw the rocky shore of their homeland, and Odysseus, overcome with fatigue, fell asleep. While he slept, the crew became overwhelmed with curiosity about the ox-hide bag. They were sure it held a rare treasure, so they undid the cord. Winds rushed out at terrific speed, and the ship was driven all the way back to Aeolus. Odysseus pleaded with the king of the winds to help him once more, but his pleas were in vain. The king said that the curse of the gods must be on these Greeks, and with severe words he drove them back on their way. The next ordeal was at the hand of giant and ferocious cannibals called Laestrygonians. They destroyed all the ships except the one with Odysseus on board, and as the sailors swam for safety, they speared them. With only his one ship left, Odysseus reached the island that was home to Circe, daughter of the sun. He sent his lieutenant and a portion of his crew to explore the interior of the island. They found the palace of Circe, all marble, silver, and gold deep in the woods. Circe welcomed them and offered them drugged wine. All but the lieutenant entered and accepted the wine. When the men were all drunk, she struck them with her wand, and though inside they were still human, on the outside they were now swine. The lieutenant returned to Odysseus on the ship and told him of this terrible event. Odysseus set forth at once to save his men, meeting on his way the god Hermes. Hermes gave him a marvelous root that had the power to ward off Circe's magic. When Odysseus entered the palace, Circe treated him the same as the others, but her enchantments were powerless against the root. In this way, she recognized him, for his arrival on her island had been foretold. Although Odysseus could resist Circe's magic, he couldn't resist her physical charms, and he spent an entire year in her palace, forgetting Penelope completely. But his comrades urged him to remember Ithaca, and finally he asked Circe to free his crew and allow them all to depart. Reluctantly, she agreed, but she warned him of dangers ahead and told him that if he wanted to know his future, he should seek the realm of the dead and there speak to the great seer Tiresias. So Odysseus traveled on to the land of the Cimmerians, who lived in total darkness in a region at the edge of Hades, the underworld. He reached a spot where two rivers mix at the entrance to Hades, and there he killed a black ram and a ewe, spilling their blood into a trench he dug. Immediately the shadows of the dead rushed forth, attracted by the smell of the blood. The prophet Tiresias arrived and told Odysseus his future. He said the flocks of the sun were pasturing on the coast of Sicily. If he and his companions injure them, he alone would escape and would return home after long suffering. If they did not harm the herds, they would soon see Ithaca. Then Odysseus' mother appeared and told him she had died of grief, and that his father, Laertes, was still living, but in memories and bitterness. After that came Agamemnon and Achilles, his two companions from the Battle of Troy. Achilles told him of the dark, joyless life of Hades, and Agamemnon told him of his wife's betrayal when he returned from the war. The ghosts crowded in on Odysseus, thousands and thousands of them, and for once losing heart, he raced back to his ship and sailed away as fast as he could. The men then sailed with great caution near the island of the Sirens. These twin sisters lured men to their death by the spell of their irresistibly beautiful singing. Odysseus had been warned for this by Circe, so he made the men plug their ears with wax. Then he had them tie him to the masthead and made them swear not to release him no matter what he said or how he acted. This way, he hoped to hear the magic of the siren songs without being destroyed. As the song of the sirens reached him, Odysseus desperately tugged and pulled up the ropes that bound him, but they held, and he passed by the island safely.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Unlock the marvels of mycology and take a journey of deep discovery into the divine. LordofSpore.com has 21 unique varieties of magic mushroom spores that will open doors you never knew existed. From the shamanic rituals of 10,000-year-old tribes, to Plato, Socrates, the Dionysian mysteries, and even early Christianity, entheogens have been the key to unlocking the secrets of the infinite realm that we are all part of, offering us mere mortals a glimpse into the sacred meaning of everything we see, and everything we don't. Join us on our journey. It starts with a few microscopic mushroom spores, and it grows into a network across time and space, connecting us all to infinity and beyond.
Next, they sailed through the strait that divides Sicily from Italy. On one side was the monster Scylla, and on the other the monster Charybdis. 6 of the crew were destroyed, but by following the instructions of Circe, Odysseus was able to save the rest. Finally, they reached the land where the oxen herds of the sun were pastured. Odysseus tried in vain to get his men to push onward, but they were weary and insisted on resting on shore. When their protests began to approach mutiny, Odysseus gave in on the condition that no one must harm the sacred oxen. They still had sufficient supplies of corn and wine given to them by Circe, and there was no need for further food. But then the weather turned bad, and they were forced to stay a month. The food ran out, and they lived by catching fish and trapping birds. One day, while Odysseus slept, the men slew some of the oxen and prepared to feast on them. But as they roasted the oxen, the meat groaned aloud on the spits, and the skins came to life and crawled after the men. The sun, in a rage, demanded vengeance, or else he swore to never again light the heavens and to retire to Hades. It was Zeus, king of the gods, who exacted the revenge. As soon as the crew put out to sea, a terrible storm rose, and finally a lightning bolt shattered the ship, tossing them all into the sea. As prophesied, only Odysseus survived. He clung to the broken mast and barely escaped Charybdis, one of the monsters guarding the strait. He floated for 9 days and finally was cast ashore on the island of Ogygia, where Calypso held him captive until the intercession of Athena, who won him a pardon from Zeus. Now the tale Odysseus has been telling is at an end. He begs permission to depart for Ithaca, and the Phaeacians agreed to help. They load him with gifts and put him aboard a galley that is leaving that evening and will arrive in Ithaca by morning. When they reach their destination, Odysseus is asleep. They carry him onto shore and leave him under an olive tree with his presents piled next to him. Athena, his patron goddess, spreads a mist over the land so he won't recognize it, and then she takes the guise of a shepherd boy. When he awakes, she asks him his story and is amused and proud when Odysseus makes up an elaborate lie. Then she reveals her true identity and fills him in on the situation in Ithaca. To protect his identity, she touches him with her wand and turns him into an old beggar clad in filthy rags. In this disguise, Odysseus seeks out his old faithful swineherd Eumaeus. Eumaeus is of noble birth and in Odysseus' absence has been acting as overseer of his estate. Not recognizing the absent prince, he treats him as a welcomed guest just the same and tells him about Penelope and her suitors and the absence of his lord. But he warns the beggar not to pretend he has news of Odysseus, as so many others have in hope of earning a reward. The beggar tells a fanciful story saying he knew Odysseus well and even fought by his side, and he wagers that one day Odysseus will return. Eumaeus is not so hopeful, and he listens to the beggar's story with skepticism, but he nevertheless makes his guest comfortable, offering him a place by the fire. In the meantime, Odysseus' son Telemachus has been so well entertained by Menelaus and Helen that he stayed with them a month. Athena comes to him in a dream and scolds him for his procrastination, telling him Penelope is under much pressure from her suitors, especially the wealthiest Eurymachus. Jolted into action, Telemachus leaves the next morning, and as he departs, he sees an eagle fly overhead with a white goose in its talons. Helen interprets the omen to mean Odysseus is returning from afar and will wreak a terrible vengeance. Telemachus arrives in Ithaca and travels by foot to the lodge of Eumaeus, for he knows an ambush awaits him. The swineherd is joyous to see his young lord, and Odysseus must exercise great self-control and not revealing his true identity. Telemachus sends Eumaeus to tell Penelope of his safe return. Then when father and son are alone, Athena appears, although she can only be seen by Odysseus. She tells him to make himself known. The rags Odysseus are wearing fall to the ground, and royal robes clothe him, and he is once more his imposing and noble self. For a while, both father and son are so overcome with emotion that neither can speak. Then they tell their stories, and they begin to plot. They consider who among the household has been faithful and who will help them slay the suitors, for Odysseus will be satisfied with nothing else. Telemachus returns to the palace, where he is greeted by the suitors with a pretense of courtesy. Eumaeus follows with Odysseus, who has once more donned the disguise of a beggar. But although the disguise conceals his identity from men, it does not fool his old dog Argus, who recognizes him at once and feebly wags his tail. The faithfulness of his old hunting dog brings tears to Odysseus' eyes. Argus rises and tries to meet his master, but the effort is too much, and he dies. Odysseus enters the hall and begs some food from each suitor. They all refuse except for one named Antinous, who hurls a stool at the beggar. This is such a blatant violation of Greek hospitality that the others rebuke him. Then another beggar appears, a brawny man who threatens to drive Odysseus from the hall. With one great blow, Odysseus breaks the jaw of his rival and then drags him out into the courtyard. The suitors mock the beggars and present Odysseus with a sham victory prize of mincemeat and blood. One of them, a gentle young man, is kind to him, and Odysseus is moved by the fate which awaits this youth. Now Penelope enters the hall and speaks to the beggar, who tells her Odysseus is on his way to Ithaca. Happy and grateful for this news, she orders that the beggar be taken to the baths and treated with great courtesy. He refuses, however, to have anyone attend him except Euryclea, a maidservant who has remained loyal in his absence. While bathing his feet, the elderly nurse notices a scar on his thigh and recognizes her master. The scar was caused by a boar on one of his early hunting expeditions as a young man. Odysseus stifles her scream of surprise and swears her to secrecy. The next day is the festival of Apollo. The suitors all come to the hall to make revelry, and they continue to make fun of the beggar. A seer warns the guests that portents of doom are evident, but they jeer at him and tell him he's as unwelcome as the beggar. Penelope enters carrying Odysseus' bow, which he left behind when he left for Troy. She tells all present that her husband could drive an arrow through the hollow rings of 12 axe heads set in a straight line. She says that if any suitor present can duplicate this feat, he will have her hand in marriage. Each of the rivals makes the effort, but none can even bend the bow. When the beggar announces he will try, all the men laugh, but he picks up the bow, bends it easily, and sends an arrow directly to the target, barely even taking time to aim. Now it is time for his vengeance. The rags fall from the beggar, and there stands Odysseus, king of Ithaca. First, he drives an arrow through the neck of Antinous, the suitor who threw a stool at him when he first appeared as a beggar. Then, with the help of his son Telemachus and his swineherd Eumaeus and one other servant, he fights the entire assembly, killing each man present one by one. He grants mercy only to two. One is a messenger who is considered neutral, and one is a bard. Then he asks that the unfaithful serving women be brought to him. 12 had become mistresses to the suitors, and these he takes outside and has hung by the neck, so they will suffer before they die. Now his vengeance is complete, and Odysseus is satisfied. Penelope had returned to her chamber before the slaughter began, but when she hears of it from the devoted nurse Eurycleia, she rushes down. She believes what Eurycleia has said about the suitors being killed, but she's doubtful about the nurse's story that it's Odysseus who's killed them. Too many years of waiting and false rumors have made her skeptical. Even when she sees Odysseus and recognizes him, she is still doubtful. So Odysseus bathes and dresses himself in the same splendor Athena had put on him. Then he returns to Penelope. In all appearances, he is just the same as he was 20 years ago when he left Ithaca for Troy. Now Penelope knows it appears to be him, but she wonders if a god has taken on his appearance to trick her. So she comes up with a plan for uncovering the truth. She knows that Odysseus' bed was built around a live olive tree by he himself, and that it can't be moved. She also knows that only she, Odysseus, and Eurycleia know this. So in front of Odysseus, she bids a servant to bring the Lord his own bed from their bridal chamber. Odysseus, annoyed by this command, yells out that no one could move that bed. He has passed the test. Penelope's doubts are erased, and she takes him in her arms. Then they retired to their chamber, where they filled each other in on the last 20 years. In order to give them more time, Athena delays the sunrise. The next morning, Odysseus sets out to his father's farm. Meanwhile, in Hades, Hermes arrives with the souls of the dead suitors. There are over 100 of them. Agamemnon asks about the circumstances of their deaths, and when he hears about the slaughter in Ithaca's royal hall, he is greatly impressed by Odysseus' prowess and by Penelope's fidelity. In Ithaca, Odysseus arrives at his father's house and identifies himself. The old man is joyful. At the same time, relatives of the dead suitors are planning revenge, have taken up arms, and are heading for Laertes' farm. On Olympus, Athena confers with Zeus. He decides that Odysseus' revenge was just and gives Athena permission to interfere as she wills. When the angry kinsmen arrive at the farm, Odysseus leads out his small party to meet them. Laertes, Odysseus, Telemachus, and their supporters kill several in the group, and the rest flee in panic. Athena arrives and orders an end to the conflict. Zeus sends down a thunderbolt that sanctifies this command, and the battle ends. Later, Athena establishes peace between the factions, and Odysseus resumed his reign as king over a happy and peaceful kingdom. At the end of the Odyssey, it seems that the troubles and conflicts of Odysseus are finally over. at least for the time being. Yet these struggles have been instrumental in the growth and development of his character and seem even to be his lifeblood. For Odysseus is a man who can only truly be involved in life through conflict. He is a man who would languish unhappily on a beautiful island of Calypso, which other men would consider a paradise. Involvement in life and with men must contain struggle to this hero, or it has no value. He willingly faces every test of wit and strength and even seeks these tests when they don't readily appear. In this sense, Odysseus is an example of the new man who was developing in the Homeric age, the individual, and more specifically, the individual who was in conflict with the old communal order. Even though the community of Ithaca would like their queen to remarry and establish order in the land, Odysseus comes charging in and upsets those plans with the sheer force of his will. Odysseus is also a strong contrast to his crew, which functions as a community and one that is dependent on their leader. Odysseus stands alone and independent. The goal of the hero of the Odyssey, like the hero of the Iliad, is to lead a glorious life and thus defeat death. Such a life should involve struggle and the knowledge of one's mortality, the knowledge that one is not a god. This is not a discovery that necessarily should bring despair, since Homer clearly shows the superiority of the mortals in both books. The gods were neither just nor merciful. They were gods simply because they were immortal and possessed special powers. Homer gives a glimpse into what life would be like without struggles and conflict when he introduces us to the society of the Lotus Eaters, who are drugged into an almost inanimate state. Next to Odysseus with his striving, questioning, and battling, they seem like death in life. The struggles of Odysseus are key to the typical hero's journey. He must first experience several periods of danger and near death before he is reborn and can live life as a fully formed man. With inner awareness and strength, his wanderings became a symbol of the wanderings of his soul, the quest for understanding, insight, and truth. There are many obstacles on this journey, and each requires great courage and faith. But the reward is great, for when the hero has been steadfast and has remained true to his dream, he reaches his final and ultimate destination. He is delivered home. So, that was all I wanted to share with you about the Odyssey. I hope you liked the book itself, and I hope you liked the information that I gave you about the book. If you haven't read the book yet, by all means, just go ahead and read it. It's one of the books that is an essential part of the must-read before you die list. So, that'll be all for today. We will be talking about other immortal books in our literature episodes to come, so stay tuned. This is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening to the episode, and I will see you next time.